back again on the Jump Scare Story channel. For this story, there is a story entitled The Aroma of Coffee and Blood in the Old Factory. Before we continue with the story, first press the like button on this video, and don't forget to press the subscribe button on this channel. Also, turn on the notification bell so you don't miss other stories. And what is the story like this time? Let's go straight into the story.
Crack! Sony jumped in surprise when he heard the sound of something falling. He, who was busy carrying a sack full of coffee, suddenly stopped. "What's that sound?" Sony asked, looking around, but he didn't see anything. There were only piles of sacks. Suddenly, the hairs on Sony's neck stood up. Behind him, it was as if someone had passed by. Sony looked back again, and again, there was nothing. Maybe it's just my feeling, said Sony. He returned to carrying the incredibly heavy sack. Just as Sony was about to take a step, he heard a creaking sound, like someone playing on a swing. Sony looked to the right and left again. Why is there a swing sound? This is a factory. What's going on? Sony immediately moved aside. Maybe it's from the building next door. Actually, he didn't know what the building next to the factory was because Sony had just started working there.
Hey, young man, you're just carrying it for so long. Are you serious about working or not? Reprimanded Bah Darmo, a slightly hunched old man. He was the trusted foreman of Mr. Suryo, the owner of the coffee factory. Oh, yes, Bah. Sorry, I heard the sound of something falling, Sony answered innocently. Bah Darmo capped the floor with his wooden stick, a cigar tucked between his fingers. He glared at Sony. Do you want to work or chat? Don't make up stories. I've been working here for decades. There's nothing like that. Bah Darmo's voice was firm.
Sony was silent. He was surprised by Bah Darmo's direct answer with a high intonation, and it was as if he could read Sony's mind. It's not like that, Bah. I just said there was a sound of something falling. Maybe one of the sacks collapsed, Sony replied. He was still relaxed in responding to Bah Darmo, as if to cover up his discomfort. You're still new and you're already denying it? Do you want to work or do you want me to fire you, huh? Bah Darmo retorted, his old voice trembling violently. Sony immediately lowered his head. He should have realized that this was his first time working. Oh, yes, sorry, Bah. Sony immediately walked towards the storage area for the coffee that was going to be ground. Sony heard a creaking sound again. This time it was no longer the sound of a swing. Sony did not want to waste time and get scolded. He continued walking without looking here and there. There was a drop of water that made Roni's feet slip and almost fall when he stepped on the falling liquid.
Astaghfirullah al-Azim. Luckily, I didn't fall. Sony's chest was pounding hard due to the shock of falling. Sony was forced to lower the sack to the floor. He returned to the place where he was about to fall just now. Sony crouched down with trembling hands. He touched the liquid. It was sticky and slimy, a little warm. What kind of water is this? Why does it look like blood? Sony asked himself. Sony raised his finger. The red color stuck to Sony's hand. Suddenly, Sony frowned. Why does it look like blood? Is this really blood? Sony smelled the liquid. Ah, yes, this is blood. How come? Where did this blood come from? Sony looked up, but there was nothing there, which made Roni even more surprised. Strange? What's so strange? You stopped here. If you don't intend to work, you'd better go home now. Darmo's voice boomed with anger. Sony immediately got up and stood with a tense body. It was useless if he answered. It was still wrong like before. Sorry, I just slipped. If you don't believe me, I'll continue. Sony immediately walked and returned to carrying the sack. Sony passed through the corridors filled with grinding machines that were probably decades old. Their colors had faded and even rusted everywhere, but they were still able to produce well.
Suddenly, the wind blew hard. The aroma of Robusta coffee mixed with rusty metal and the stench of blood wafted. Sony almost vomited. But what was strange was where the wind came from, because there was no gap at all for the wind to enter strongly. There was only a small air vent. Sony tried to hold his breath. He didn't want to be affected anymore and get scolded. After going through a very long corridor, he now arrived at the warehouse where the coffee was stored. Sony put down the sack. He wiped his sweat and took a deep breath. Sony turned towards the source of the sound, as if someone was pulling the sack, but there was no one. The hairs on Sony's neck suddenly stood up. Sony shook his head. He turned around to leave the place, but suddenly the door closed very hard. Sony was surprised because there was no wind. He immediately walked towards the door. Click, click. Strangely, the door seemed to be locked from the outside. Sony panicked. In a stuffy and dark place, there was only a little sunlight from the gaps in the holes in the roof tiles. Knock, knock! Whoever's there, please open the door, Sony shouted, hoping someone would hear him and help him get out of the place, but no one answered. The atmosphere suddenly became silent. Sony also felt suffocated because the air couldn't fully enter, especially with the piles of coffee that made his nose sneeze. Help! Help! Is there anyone outside? Please help me! I'm locked inside! Sony screamed. His voice echoed, but no one responded at all. Faintly, Sony heard the sound of a heartbreaking cry. Sony immediately looked back. He turned his gaze looking for the source of the sound, but there was nothing. Why is there someone crying? Where is the sound coming from? Is it from behind this factory? Asked Sony, trying to think logically. Again, a groaning sound was heard, this time like someone in pain and asking for help. What's really going on? What's going on in this factory? If it's a matter of old age, it can't be this scary, thought Sony. Crack, 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 crack. A sound like something broken and torn came from one of the burlap sacks. Very carefully, Sony walked towards the source of the sound. Curiosity overcame his fear. For some reason, it was as if someone was saying that Sony had to see the sound. Sony's eyes glared at one of the burlap sacks of coffee. He saw blood flowing. Blood, said Sony as he continued to approach. Sony squatted and was about to touch the burlap sack that was bleeding and moving. What are you doing? The voice made Sony jump in surprise. What are you doing here, Roni? Darmo's voice boomed through the silence of the storage warehouse. He narrowed his eyes and glared at Sony. Sony stood up and faced Darmo. Beads of cold sweat wet his temples. Sony took a deep breath and tried to control himself. His heart was beating erratically.
With slow movements, he wiped the dripping sweat, then dared to look back at Darmo.
That miss! I saw someone moving, Sony answered, her voice caught in her throat. Every word she said felt heavy, as if there was a heavy weight pressing on her chest. The cold air pierced her bones. A faint shadow flashed quickly in front of them, almost invisible, but enough to freeze her blood. Both of them were silent, rooted to their places. The sound of creaking metal was heard again. This time, it wasn't only Sony who heard it. Miss Darmo also gasped, her face tensed.
Sony turned quickly towards the source of the sound. His eyes scanned every corner of the room. An extraordinary feeling of fear suddenly came over Darmo. With his old age and wrinkles decorating his face, he looked around, looking for the source of the sound. Actually, this was not the first time he had heard strange sounds in this factory. Unnatural things often haunted him, accompanying his loneliness in the midst of the hustle and bustle of the factory.
But this time, it felt different.
Darmo, did you hear that? Sony asked, trying to convince his foreman that he wasn't hallucinating. Darmo was jolted from his reverie. His face, which was originally tense, now looked pale. The wrinkles on his face seemed to deepen, depicting the fear that was creeping into his heart. His voice wasn't as firm as before. There was a subtle tremor that betrayed his self-confidence.
That's the sound of rats. Besides, behind this factory, there are empty fields and rice fields. It's possible that the rats came in through the gaps. Go back to your place quickly, Darmo scolded, trying to cover up his nervousness. His tones sounded rough, but Sony could feel the fear hidden behind it. Sony nodded his head. This was his first job, and he didn't want to lose his livelihood just because of a small mistake. Okay, sorry. I'll take my leave now. Without looking back, Sony hurried to leave Darmo. But there was one question that kept spinning in Sony's mind. How could Darmo enter the warehouse, even though he felt the warehouse was locked? Did Darmo lock him in there on purpose? Then why? Moreover, Darmo was very angry when Sony was about to touch the strangely moving gunny sack. Sony returned to his workplace. The coffee factory is divided into 3 main divisions, namely drying, grinding, and packaging. Each division has its own duties and responsibilities. Sony works in the grinding section, in charge of putting dry coffee beans into the grinding machine and ensuring the machine works smoothly. Where have you been, Ron? Why are you taking so long? Asked Anga, his colleague in the same division. Sony turned to Anga. His face was still pale, but he tried to smile to cover up the fear that was still lingering in his mind.
I was asked by Darmo to lift the sacks because the others were on their break to eat, Sony answered matter-of-factly. Oh, yeah, that's the job at the mill. If there's no one to lift the sacks, we'll take them ourselves, Anga replied. Come here, son. Let me teach you how to do it properly, Anga called, pointing to a large grinding machine. Hot steam billowed from the machine, filling the air with the aroma of coffee mixed with oil. Sony approached, sunlight coming in through the large window on the side of the room.
Anga looked deft in putting coffee beans into the machine's funnel, adjusting the lever with agile movements. The coffee beans fell down, grabbed by the sharp blades inside the machine, producing fine coffee grounds that piled up in the collection container. Sony imitated Anga's movements,
but his hands felt stiff and not used to it. He felt the strong vibration of the machine, as if there was a hidden energy pulsing inside it. When the machine started working, suddenly he heard something. A soft, heart-breaking groan was heard.
The sound sounded like a soft but piercing groan of pain. Sony flinched, his body tensed. He sharpened his hearing, trying to find the source of the sound amidst the din of the grinding machine. "Sir, do you hear something groaning?" asked Sony, his voice trembling, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up in response to the cold air that suddenly attacked. Anga shook his head, his eyes remained focused on the machine. Nothing, son. It's just the sound of the machine. It's old, so it often makes strange sounds. Don't think about it." Sony swallowed hard. He tried to ignore the groaning sound and convinced himself that it was just the sound of an old, broken machine. But the longer the sound became clearer and closer, as if it came from inside the grinding machine itself. Suddenly, the sound of something falling broke his concentration. Sony looked back. His heart was pounding. Dark shadows danced on the wall, lit by the dim, flickering lights. Sony squinted his eyes, trying to see clearly what had fallen. But it was empty. There was nothing. There was only a pile of burlap sacks filled with coffee beans piled up in the corner of the room. Dust flying in the air, creating a gloomy and tense atmosphere. Sony took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. Maybe he was just too tired and starting to hallucinate. Someone tapped Sony's shoulder. Sony jumped in surprise, immediately looked back. "Just rest, son. Your face is really pale," said Anga, patting Sony's shoulder, breaking his reverie. Sony nodded weakly, feeling relieved to be able to get away from the scary grinding machine. He walked unsteadily to the corner of the room and sat on a rickety wooden bench. The bench creaked softly when Sony sat on it, adding to the very scary atmosphere. Sony closed his eyes, trying to relieve the dizziness and fear that gripped him. When he opened his eyes, Sony's gaze fell on a pile of freshly ground coffee grounds. The coffee grounds were dark brown, almost black, with a strong and appetizing aroma. But there was something strange among the coffee grounds. There was something hard, white, and strangely shaped. Sony's heart felt like it stopped beating. He got up and approached. Sony narrowed his eyes. He grabbed the object with trembling hands. A small piece of bone was stuck between the freshly ground coffee grounds. The bone looked fragile and dirty, with grinding marks on several sides. What is this? Why does it look like a bone? Yes, this is a bone. Sony grabbed the object. His chest was beating fast. What bone? It's impossible. An animal. Sony continued. The sound of footsteps echoed in the room. Sony was still fixated on the object that was currently in his hand. His curiosity was getting higher. "Sony, what are you doing there?" Ba Darmo's deep voice was suddenly heard right behind Sony. Sony was shocked. His breath was beating fast. The small piece of bone that he had just lifted almost slipped from his hand. He turned his body slowly. Ba Darmo's figure was standing in the doorway of the warehouse. His hunched body added to the scary impression. His old face was shrouded in shadow. Only a pair of sharp eyes exposed Sony, as if they could read his mind. Ba? Sony tried to speak.
his voice trembling. "I saw this tucked in the coffee grounds." Sonny raised his hand to show the small piece of bone. The neon light above Ronnie and Ba Darmo's heads suddenly flickered. The light that was originally bright turned dim for a moment before turning back on. Ba Darmo's shadow stretched across the wall, swaying as if alive. Sonny swallowed roughly. But instead of being shocked, Ba Darmo's face hardened. His old jaw tensed.
Don't act up. It's just a piece of wood that got ground up. But this one is really hard. It looks like... Shut up, Ba Darmo snapped. The wooden stick in his hand hit the cement floor with a loud bang. Do you think the work here is just playing around? Hurry back to the grinding room. Don't ever mess around with something that isn't your job again. The angry tone pierced Sonny's ears, but instead added a question mark to Sonny's mind. If it's really just a piece of wood, why is Ba Darmo so upset? Trembling, Sonny nodded. He slipped the piece of bone into his trouser pocket unconsciously, just wanting to get away from Ba Darmo's cold gaze. Meanwhile, in the grinding room, the machine was still roaring. The sound of the machine filled every ear cavity. Anga waved his hand, calling, "Where have you been, Ron? Ba Darmo even looked for you." Sonny tried to answer, but his mind was still stuck on the small bone in his pocket. He felt the object throbbing warmly, as if it were alive.
"I was just resting in the back room, but instead I was told to check the sacks." Anga nodded while continuing to adjust the machine lever. "Okay, quickly help me. The pile of beans that haven't been ground yet." Sonny took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. He turned on the machine's funnel. The coffee beans fell in succession, colliding with the iron blade. The sound was normally just mechanical friction, but this time there was another sound that came in at the same time, a soft groan, like someone groaning in pain from inside the machine. Sonny stopped, his heart beating fast. "Did you hear that?" Anga glanced over, especially since the sound of his old machine was like that, not the sound of machine like someone. Sonny stared at the machine as if it could penetrate the thick steel. The light above blinked 3 times. The room was dim. A black shadow seemed to be crawling on the wall. The sound of moaning was getting clearer. "Don't think too much about it. You'll go crazy if every sound is considered strange," said Anga, even though his own expression was starting to become restless. Sonny nodded weakly. He returned to work, forcing himself, even though the fear was getting worse. But every time the machine turned on, the soft sound was heard again, sometimes like a heartbreaking moan, and sometimes like a soft, sad cry. A few hours later, Sonny asked permission to go to the bathroom. His steps were unsteady, his body was weak. The wooden bathroom door creaked when it was opened. Sonny went in and turned on the light. The dull yellow light shone on the blurry mirror on the wall. His pale face stared back. Sonny turned on the tap water to wash his face. At first, it was clear and cold, but in a matter of seconds, the red color slowly seeped into the stream. "Oh my God!" Sonny screamed, jerking back. The water flowed like fresh blood, emitting a fishy smell that pierced his nose, making Sonny nauseous. Tock, tock, tock. 3 loud knocks were heard from outside the bathroom door. Sonny's body tensed up, cold sweat flowed. The hairs on his neck also stood up. "Who?" Sonny shouted in panic, but there was no answer. There was another knock, this time louder than before. The bathroom light suddenly flickered. The mirror shook gently.
and in the faint reflection, Sony saw something standing behind a black shadow without a face, just an empty cavity. Sony screamed hysterically. He hurriedly opened the door and ran out without caring that he was still soaked. In the factory hallway, Anga was waiting. He was surprised to see Sony come out with a panicked face and ran. "Oh my gosh, what's wrong with you, Ron?"
Sony gasped. The water turned red. There was a knock on the door. Then there was a shadow. Anga tried to calm down and digest Sony's words, which he thought didn't make sense. "You're too tired, Ron. This old factory really makes people hallucinate easily." Before Sony had time to reply, a strange sound was heard. The grinding machine, which had stopped, was now spinning by itself. The tightly locked lever was moving up and down. The coffee beans, which had not been put in, were flowing out of nowhere and falling heavily into the funnel.
"Sir, who turned on the machine?" Sony held Anga's arm tightly, sweat pouring down again. "Yes, Ron. How could that be? I don't know either. I clearly turned it off." Anga stepped back. His face was pale. His pants were wet, whether it was sweat or urine that came out. The machine roared louder. The sound changed. It was no longer just the banging of iron. There was a loud creak from inside, a long, shrill scream like a human being ground alive. Fresh blood spurted from the gaps in the machine, dripping onto the floor, causing a rancid smell. Sony and Anga were stunned. Their bodies were shaking. Anga's pants were getting wetter, and even liquid was flowing from between his pants. "Sony, is what we're seeing real?" Anga asked, his eyes unblinking as he stared at the machine. I don't know, sir. That's the sound," Sony answered, stuttering. The shaking was getting worse. Sony wanted to open his mouth again, but a choked voice couldn't come out. He could only stare at the increasingly real fear. Small bones were sticking out one by one from the coffee grounds container. The lights in the entire room went out in an instant. It was completely dark. All that was left was the sound of the engine roaring, a long scream, and the piercing smell of blood. "Run!" shouted Sony and Anga. Simultaneously, they ran through the hallway towards the packaging room, because only there were many people. They kept running and stopped right in front of the packaging employees. All eyes were on them. "What's wrong with you?" asked Santi, one of the packaging employees. "It's over there. The machine started by itself, Santi." Sony's voice broke with a stutter and trembling tone. Anga added, his face drenched in cold sweat. "We saw what looked like pieces of bone coming out of the machine. Seriously, this is real, not a hallucination." The packaging workers who were arranging the coffee packages looked at each other. The atmosphere in the room, which was originally filled with laughter and the sound of plastic, was now suddenly silent and tense. Some people got goosebumps hearing Anga and Ronnie's statements. "What do you mean? The machine starts by itself. How can that be? It's an old machine," said a man in his 30s, known as Danny. "That's right, I turned it off earlier," Sonny replied hurriedly, his voice no less trembling. But suddenly the machine started and turned. Even the coffee beans flowed in from who knows where. Santi, who had been silent all this time, immediately stood up. Her gaze turned towards the door leading to the grinding room. The air blew from the gap in the door, cold and carrying a strange aroma like coffee mixed with blood. "Then let's prove it. Don't just tell hoaxes and nonsense," Santi invited, even though the look in her eyes implied uncertainty.
Footsteps were heard almost simultaneously when the 5 people, including Sony and Anga, walked towards the grinding room. the sound of sandals and shoes clattering against the cold cement floor. The door to the grinding room opened slowly. The air in the room absorbed the steamy heat, but for some reason there was a bone-piercing cold mixed in it, making some people shiver. The grinding machine stood firmly in the middle of the room silently, not turning, as told by Anga and Sony.
There weren't even any bones, just the sound of dripping water from the leaking pipe echoing. See? Donnie shrugged, trying to laugh. Nothing. The machine was off. The floor was clean. You guys were probably too tired. Sony was silent, his eyes wildly searching every corner of the room. He was very sure of the machine that suddenly turned on by itself, the sound of the screams of the coffee coming in, and the sound of broken and flying bone fragments. Anga pressed his body against Sony, then whispered, "You saw it yourself, right? The machine was turning on by itself. We're not crazy, are we, Ron?"
Sony nodded slowly, but the sharp gaze of Darmo, who suddenly appeared behind the door, made Sony's body stiffen. "What are you all doing here?" Darmo's deep voice slapped the air, making all the employees flinch. His hunched body entered. The wooden stick hit the cement floor. "Go back to your respective places. It's time for work. Don't believe that ridiculous story. No need to make up stupid stories." The other workers bowed their heads. They dispersed slowly, even though whispers of suspicion still lingered in their minds.
Sony and Anga exchanged glances. They knew something was wrong, but who would dare to contradict Darmo? The next morning came with a thin fog covering the road to the coffee factory. Sony stood for a long time in front of the gate. His steps were heavy. His brother's face crossed his mind. The image of household needs, about his cousin who was still in school. If he stopped, there would be no more income. But if Roni entered, he would have to face terror that made his blood almost freeze. Finally, Sony pressed his chest, forcing himself in. The gate creaked when Sony pushed it. The factory atmosphere was still quiet. Only the sound of a rooster crowing could be heard from a distance. But the air that came from inside the building felt different, cold and damp, with a faint smell of rusty iron. Anga had already arrived. He waved from a distance. His face was as pale as last night.
"I thought you wouldn't dare come again, son," Anga said half-jokingly, but his laughter was bland. "What can I do, sir? I have no choice." They entered the grinding room. The old machine stood in its usual place, as if waiting. Sony took a deep breath and then began to weigh the sacks of coffee to be ground. Sony and Anga began to work. They were determined not to be afraid of anything for the sake of their family. The large burlap sack was opened. Dry coffee beans fell onto the scales. The distinctive aroma of coffee usually made Sony a little calm, but this time his nose caught a different aroma. Instead of the fragrance, the air was filled with a rotten smell that pierced his nose. The fishy smell of blood mixed with the stench of a corpse. Sony felt nauseous and covered his nose. "Sir, do you feel this smell?" asked Sony, his face tensed. Anga also bowed immediately. His expression changed. "Oh my gosh, what is this smell, Ron?"
Sony examined the coffee beans on the scale. His eyes widened. Among the beans, there was something white and hard sticking out. Sony's hands trembled as he reached for the object. Sony lifted a small bone, longer than yesterday's. Traces of grinding were still attached to the end. Anga, this is not wood. This is a human bone. Sony's voice was soft, half a whisper so that no one would hear. Anga stepped back, his face pale. Don't joke, Sony. But at that moment, something came out and flowed from another burlap sack. A thick red liquid seeped out and flowed onto the cement floor.
Slowly, blood came out from between the seams of the sack. "Oh my God, what is this?" Angus screamed, covering his mouth, his body trembling. The cold air wafted out loudly. A cold gust swept through the room. The neon lights flickered, making the shadow of the machine stretch across the wall. The aroma of coffee mixed with blood became more piercing, making Sonny's chest feel tight. The burlap sack in the corner of the room seemed to be pulsing, as if something was moving from inside. "Anga, do you see that?" Sonny asked, pointing to the sack. The sack shook. A wet sound was heard from inside, like liquid being shaken with a hard object. Blood seeped out faster and faster, making a small puddle on the floor. "Sony, don't come near him!" Angus shouted, staggering back, but Sony's eyes were fixed. A faint shadow seemed to emerge from the puddle. Pale faces, empty eyes, gaping mouths letting out groans. Sony softly covered his ears, but the sound seemed to penetrate straight into his head. The gunny sack suddenly ripped with a loud sound. Blood spurted out in all directions. Pieces of bone mixed with coffee beans spilled and rolled on the floor. A foul smell immediately hit Sonny and Anga, making them vomit. Sonny screamed as hard as he could. His hoarse voice cut through the air. He ran without looking back through the pool of blood, past the machine that was now vibrating again. Anga also screamed. His footsteps were chaotic. His sandals almost came off. The sound of other footsteps was heard chasing from behind, like the sound of giant footsteps chasing. Sony continued to run towards the exit of the milling room. His breath quickened, his eyes hot with tears of fear, blood still dripping from the end of his pants mixed with dust. "Get out! Get out quickly!" Sony shouted hysterically. The sound echoed throughout the factory corridor. Then, when Sony's hand was about to reach for the door handle, the door moved by itself, opening slowly, leaving thick darkness behind it. From the darkness, Mr. Suryo's figure appeared with his plump body wrapped in an expensive batik shirt. Beside him, Darmo stood in a half-hunched posture, holding a wooden stick. The two men looked at Sonny and Anga, who were still frozen in the middle of the room. "What's wrong with you?" Mr. Suryo asked in a deep voice, as if nothing had happened. "Why are you shouting like that?" Sonny shivered, his hand still holding the blood-stained bone. "Sir, there are human bones in the coffee sacks." Darmo laughed hoarsely, his voice echoing in the room that now felt increasingly cramped. "Bones? Where are there bones? That's just used wood, Ron. Your eyes are probably blurry." "But this is blood, sir, look!" Anga pointed at the pool of red flowing from the burlap sacks. Mr. Suryo stepped in, his shiny leather shoes stepping on the pool of blood without a care. "Blood? That's just rusty water from a leaking pipe. Have you guys watched too many horror movies?" The atmosphere suddenly became tense. Cold air swept through the room,
making Sony's hair stand on end. The neon lights flickered faster and faster. The buzzing sound of electricity became loud. Suddenly, the grinding machine, which had been turned off, began to vibrate. The rumbling sound slowly grew louder. The iron wheels began to spin by themselves. The machine roared loudly, its sound deafening. The sound of metal clashing loudly echoed throughout the room. From the gaps in the machine, a thick red liquid began to drip. "Ah, please let us go!" The sound of a woman's screams echoed from inside the machine, a heart-breaking scream that pierced the heart. The sound of crying mixed with the sound of bones being broken. White bone fragments flew out of the mouth of the machine, scattered in all directions. Blood flowed faster and formed a small river that flowed towards Sony and Unga's feet.
No, this is impossible, Sony shouted hysterically, his body shaking uncontrollably. Mr. Suryo and Ba Darmo, who were still standing in the doorway, looked calm, as if this terrifying sight was normal for them. But suddenly, their facial expressions changed, their eyes widened, their bodies stiffened as if there was an invisible force pulling them. "Why can't I move?" asked Mr. Suryo, his voice trembling.
"My legs feel like someone is holding them." Ba Darmo tried to fight back, but his body was slowly dragged into the room. The iron door closed by itself with a thunderous sound, making the whole building shake. Now the four of them were locked in the room with the grinding machine that continued to roar horribly. Sony was curled up in the corner of the room, hugging his knees tightly, sweat flowing down his cheeks.
Why is this happening? Why? Anga tried to bang on the door with all his remaining strength. Please open the door. We're trapped. But there was no answer. Only the sound of the machine getting louder and the screams from inside the machine that never stopped. Then, from the corners of the dark room, shadows began to appear, terrifying figures floating in the air, some without heads, their bodies swaying. There were also those with only heads, their eyes glowing red, staring with hatred. The most terrifying thing was a figure without legs floating, its hands dangling long until they touched the floor. "Who are you?" Mr. Suryo stepped back slowly, his voice trembling with fear. A figure without a head floating closer from its severed neck, blood dripping, its hands raised, pointing at Mr. Suryo. "You are the one who killed us," a voice without a source echoed in the room. "Every full moon you steal us and make us sacrifices."
Ba Darmo staggered back. His wooden stick fell with a loud thud. "No, we don't know anything." "Liar!" A loud scream thundered. The figure of a head without a body floated quickly closer, its eyes glowing red. "You helped him! You brought us to this cursed place!" Mr. Suryo panicked. He ran towards the iron stairs that led to the second floor, his legs trembling. Cold sweat drenched his entire body. Sorry, we didn't mean to."
Ba Darmo also tried to escape, but his old feet tripped over a pool of blood. His body fell hard. His head hit the sharp corner of the grinding machine. A loud crash echoed. Blood immediately gushed from his head, flowing heavily onto the floor. Ba Darmo's eyes widened for a moment, then slowly lost their light. His body convulsed several times, then remained still. Badarmo screamed. Mr. Suryo from the stairs saw that his foreman was dead.
Mr. Suryo's fear grew. He rushed up to the second floor, but bad luck awaited him above. His trembling right foot slipped on the slippery steps due to dripping blood. His muscular body lost its balance. Mr. Suryo fell from a height. His body hit the iron steps one by one. The sound of broken bones was clearly heard. His left arm bent, his right leg bent backwards. Blood flowed from his mouth and nose. Mr. Suryo's body landed hard on the cement floor. His eyes were still open, staring blankly at the ceiling. His chest rose and fell for a moment. His last breath came out with a sigh, and then silence. Silence enveloped the grinding machine room. Slowly stopped spinning. The screams from inside the machine also subsided. The terrifying figures began to fade back into the darkness. Suddenly, the neon lights flickered a few times, then lit up brightly. White light illuminating the room that was now full of blood and corpses. Sony was still curled up in his corner, his body trembling uncontrollably. Anga crawled slowly closer, his face pale as paper. Sony, are you still alive? Asked Anga, his voice hoarse. Sony raised his head slowly, his eyes red and his cheeks wet with tears. Anga, what just happened? I don't know, son. What is certain is that we have to get out of here as soon as possible. Anga helped Sony stand. Their legs were weak and almost unable to support their bodies. With limping steps, they headed towards the door, which was now open. Before leaving, Sony glanced back for a moment. Mr. Suryo and Ba Darmo's bodies lay motionless, their blood mixed with the blood coming out of the grinding machine. They got their comeuppance, Sony said softly. What do you mean? I remember the story of the villagers. All this time, Mr. Suryo has been practicing black magic. Every full moon, he kidnaps young girls to be used as sacrifices. They are ground together with coffee beans so that his business will be successful. Anga was silent after hearing Sony's explanation. Now it all makes sense why the coffee from that factory is so popular. Why girls often go missing around the factory area during the full moon. Why the grinding machine often makes noises by itself at night. We have to report it to the police, said Anga. Yes, but who would believe it? We better get far away from this place. They walked out of the factory with quick steps. The fresh morning air hit their faces, but the scent of blood still lingered on their clothes. The sun began to rise, but the warmth of its rays was unable to dispel the bone-piercing cold. In the distance, the crowing of a rooster was heard as usual. Village life went on normally, unaware of the terrible tragedy that had just occurred at the coffee factory that had been their pride. Sony and Anga walked along the dusty dirt road. Occasionally, they looked back to make sure no one was following. The coffee factory now looked like an ordinary building, but they knew that inside it was hidden a dark secret that had claimed many victims. Okay, friends, that's all for this story. What do you think about this story? Write your comments in the comments column. And for friends who have just joined, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe to this channel. And wait for the next horror stories on the Jump Scare Story channel. Bye!